I'm back with another video sooner than expected. I just dropped a video last week about the rapture in the book of Revelation. And after I completed the video and uploaded it, I went back and obviously watched it just to kind of get a feel for it. And I noticed that while I hit a lot of the points I wanted to hit related to the rapture itself, there's still so much material that sort of gets roped into sort of end times theology, certain sort of cultural ideas that all stem from the book of Revelation. And there's so much speculation and just sort of weird ideas around this stuff that I thought, I wish I would have addressed some of that in the previous video. And then I thought, well, why don't I just make it kind of like a part two, a second video on this where I look at some stuff that goes beyond just the rapture itself. So that's what I'd like to do today. I'm not sure how long this video will be, but I just want to walk through the actual book of Revelation and look at a lot of the symbolic imagery that we find in the scriptures and actually show very clearly how this is very, very much pointing to specific historical events, notably first century Jews living in Rome during the war between the Jews and the Romans, okay? And then that eventually results in the second collapse of the temple, okay? If you haven't watched my last video, that's basically what I was trying to sort of tease out to show that this idea of a rapture theology, dispensationalism, all this kind of sort of theories really don't have a lot of weight when we actually have a historical understanding of these texts. So like I said, I was mostly looking at the rapture, but there's so much imagery in the book of Revelation. Obviously, we have the 666, number of the beast. I had already addressed that previously, although there's a lot more I could say about that. But there's these ideas of like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, right? That's a real famous, idea. You see it certainly in pop culture in all kinds of interesting and fun ways. But there's just a lot of things. There's the 144,000. There's all the 7 seals. Okay, so I think all this stuff we can actually tease out. So I have a stack of books here. These are certainly not all-encompassing. But what I do want to talk about today, I'm not going to be reading a lot from these because it would be very arduous and time-consuming to try to flip around. But just suffice to say that I will refer to them loosely. You can always go look this stuff up yourself. There's probably 1 or 2 passages I may pull from. But when we're talking about the first century in the war that took place, there's actually Josephus, okay, the Jewish historian, and he actually has a book called Wars. And it's a very long, very detailed description of the entire history of these wars with the Jews in the Roman Empire. And there's a lot of material on there that when you start to read it, you can see clearly, symbolically, and literally shows us why John is saying the things he's saying when he's writing his book that's based off a vision he's having about the end times, which of course is this, in fact, war. It's not the true end times, it's the end times of the Israelites as a people, okay? Now, I talked about in my previous video that this is called a preterist viewpoint. There's different forms of preterism. You could talk about a partial preterism or a whole preterism. It could be preterism or preterism, it doesn't matter how you want to pronounce it. But the partial preterism is probably the more orthodox because it still believes that there will be a bodily coming of Jesus of Nazareth at a later date, and it still believes that at some point there will be a resurrection of the dead in some type of embodied form, okay? The full preterist position believes it's all already happened, okay? Everything can be accounted for. So those are just some fundamental distinctions that I'm just briefly highlighting again today. In case you haven't watched that other video, go watch it. This is another one, Eusebius, another history, ecclesiastical history of the church. This also covers a lot of the material from that era, and I do want to maybe make reference to that, whether specifically or even just generally. I showed this book last time. This is a really good resource. I mentioned it, not only is it just kind of lay everything out kind of in a very full systematic way, and kind of provides all the best arguments for various positions. it does a very fair job. It also has a really extensive secondary list of secondary sources that you can pull from if you want to do more research. Because there's no shortage of material out there, but sometimes it's hard to know, well, what's like, the really credible, good stuff to read. And this author, Gentry, does a good job of that. But before I get too far away from the subject at hand, I'm going to title this video, The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, because I think that that's probably one of the most famous or infamous images that comes from the Bible. And I do think when we take in the preterist or preterist position, we get some very clear answers. And with the help of people like Josephus and Eusebius, they kind of add additional illumination around these experiences. So I'm just looking at the book of Revelation. Like any modern Bible, you're going to have some chapter breaks and some chapter headings. And I'm just going to use those to kind of remind myself of some of this material. A lot of these ideas are kind of circulating ideas. Like he hits on the idea kind of in one symbolic form, and then it kind of comes back. And a lot of times it can be multiple things. So we talked about this a little bit when we talked about this imagery of the dragon or the beast, and that it's kind of representational of, the historical idea of, sort of demonic or devils in terms of malevolent fallen angels, but it's also symbolic of malevolent kings or Caesars who are ruling Rome. Just as a caveat, because I know the 666 thing is a real famous, infamous passage in the book of Revelation. If you want to get a detailed account of how they explain that the 666 numerical mark of the beast is actually clearly referring to Caesar Nero, this book covers it in depth. Again, probably most books at this point in time would cover that, but there's some other things that this guy pointed out that were really interesting that I didn't know about Caesar Nero that also play into this idea of some of the symbolism we find in the Revelation, okay? So some of it is even the imagery of the beast, okay? So Nero was known for being this bestial, horrific human being. I mean, he was terrible to everyone. He killed his own family. He was just horrendous. He actually used to attack. He would dress up in animal skins and run around his castle or whatever, and like he would have prisoners or slaves or even just servants like chained up in his property, and he'd run around in a animal skin and actually bite their genitalia, and he was literally a madman. So what that's just one story. There's so many more. But one of the things that Gentry points out, and he uses a lot of reference points, is that actually even the Romans referred to him as the beast. That was actually, or the monster. They actually referred to him as the monster, the beast. So that was a very clear term specifically referring to Nero. And it wasn't just in John's Revelation. It was in other texts of the era when they would speak about Nero. They would talk about him as a beast. Furthermore, there's also a direct tie to serpents. There's a long-standing story about Nero as a child where there were apparently men coming to basically murder him because they didn't want him to be the future Caesar of Rome. And when they went to, smother him as a child, they found the skin of, they thought it was a snake under his pillow. And there's different stories. One of them was a live snake came out. The other, it was the skin of a snake that would have been put under his pillow by his mother or one of his maidens as sort of like a curse. But he was known that snake skin was then turned into a bracelet by his mother that he wore around his wrist. And so he had this direct tie to serpents as well, and this imagery of a serpent, which we also see. If that's not enough, we know the serpent's red. Now, the color red is going to be something we see come up in the book of Revelation a lot. It's most specifically related to the color of Rome. If you know anything about the Roman centurions, the soldiers would wear red garments, red cloaks. So there's obviously the warring red of the Romans. Of course, blood is red as well, so we get that imagery. But what I didn't know is that Caesar apparently was a ginger. And one of the things he was known for having was a thick red beard. And so the imagery of a red dragon or a red beast, again, just another layer of interesting metaphor and symbolism that we find in John's Revelation. So some of that stuff was even new to me. I was like, wow, that's really fascinating. But anyways, before we get any further on that, let's look at this. So in the book of Revelation, we obviously have the prologue that's setting this all up, where John is telling us what's happening. And then where this starts is with the 7 churches, okay? Now, one thing that people have all kind of recognized, regardless of where they fall in the spectrum of the theology around the end times, is that these were 7 real churches. The bigger question was, are these 7 churches just being used as a symbol or metaphor for all churches, or is it specifically about these churches, or what? It's probably both and, but again, when we re-anchor this in the first century, it's no question that these are actually real churches that he's referring to, and it makes it a little less abstract. He's actually talking about these 7 churches. He also talks about the 7 trumpets, but we get clarification on that in the book itself, where it actually explains that each of these churches has an assigned angel, right, to the church, and these angels are symbolically represented through the trumpets, okay? So the 7 trumpets are the 7 angels who are assigned to the 7 churches. And that's essentially where the book of Revelation kind of gets going, up until we get into this story about the 7 seals, okay? So let me just go through here. This is the passage in 4 where he's talking about the living creatures, where he stands before the throne of God, the scroll of lands. Okay, so it gets, by the time we get through the 7 churches and the seven what do you call it? What I say? The 7 lampstands, the 7 lights, the 7 stars. These are all symbolic of the angels. We get to the 7 seals. Okay, so this is where it can also get some of this real infamous imagery, right? So I just want to look at chapter 6 here at the beginning, and we're going to look about who are the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And actually, we have very clear answers. So let me start over. Now I watched when the Lamb opened one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures say with a voice like thunder, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a white horse. So this is the first one. And its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. Okay, keep going. When he opened the 2nd seal, I heard the 2nd living creature say, "Come," and came out another horse, which is bright red. So you have the first horse, which is white, the second one, which is bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people could slay one another, and he was given a great sword. Okay, so this is going to be important. This is basically saying the 2nd horse brings peace, but it's peace by the sword. Okay, keep that in mind. And it's red also. Okay. Then we keep going. When he opened the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd living creature say, "Come," and I looked, and behold, a black horse. So this is the 3rd horse. And its rider had a pair of scales in its hand, like a weighing scale. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the 4 living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil or wine." Okay, so this is talking about buying and selling of wheat and barley, not oil and wine. And this is actually a reference to what we'll learn about later, which is a famine. Okay, one of the things that John talks about is there's going to be a widespread famine in the land, and therefore the cost of everything to just get food has gone up. Okay, now let's look at number 7. When he opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of a 4th living creature say, "Come," and I looked, and behold, a pale horse. All right, the pale rider, if you're an old Western fan. And its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed with him. And they were given authority over a 1/4 of the earth to kill with sword and with famine, okay, and with pestilence, and by wild beasts of the earth. Okay, those are the 4 riders of the apocalypse. Now, there's also more seals that get open that several things happen with. But before I get too far off that, I want to look at these four riders. Now, the first rider doesn't give us much information about it. It says he was on the white horse. Now, there's different opinions. Some people interpret that horse as Jesus, right, who came already, and he's the king, the true king, who is the reigning king that comes to sort of restore and redeem his creation. But then there's a second rider on the red horse who he allows to gain peace over the nations, but through the act of the sword, okay? There's also a different interpretation that believes that the first rider is actually the Antichrist, who's essentially starting the apocalypse off, okay? And that's also a possibility because we see here that he held a bow in his hand, okay? Like a bow and arrow, and that seems very much like, interestingly enough, the pagan deity Apollo, okay? Now, Apollo is actually mentioned in the book of Revelation, which we will look at later, and he is the deity or the demon, really, who's responsible for opening the gates of hell. So I think that's probably a better actual interpretation of that first horse. It's probably the god Apollo. Now, what makes this even more interesting, that I also didn't know, Nero was a worshiper of Apollo. In fact, he even referred to himself as the son of Apollo. Okay, and he had a sort of a cult worship around himself, but a cult worship around Apollo. In fact, they even have Roman coins from the era that have Caesar Nero on it, as well as Apollo. Okay, Apollo was a very popular pagan deity in this time period of Rome. It was, like I said, directly correlated to Caesar Nero, and Apollo is tied to his sister Artemis, and they were known for being archers. Okay, they would fire arrows. So I think that's probably a more accurate assessment, that this is probably the Antichrist as the first horseman coming out to start this era of tribulation, and it probably was a symbolic representation of Apollo. Either way, the text in this particular instance doesn't give us a lot to work with, but to me, the fact that he has an arrow kind of alludes to that. I don't think Jesus of Nazareth would come holding an arrow, so that kind of rules him out. But, there's different opinions. From there on, though, we get a much better idea, okay? So the red horse, well, what do we know is red? Rome, okay? Rome is red. They literally wear red. Their soldiers wear red. But more specifically, what this is an allusion to clearly is what's known as Pax Romana, which is the Roman peace that's brought by Caesar Augustus, okay? Caesar Augustus is known for bringing this peace, quote unquote, throughout the entire region, the known world, through the strong arm of the sword, right? They build this impenetrable army, and it spreads itself out and basically creates peace, but it's a peace through violence. And this is clearly what the second horse is, right? The red horse is clearly a reference to Pax Romana, the peace of the Romans through the sword, and Caesar Augustus as the red horse, okay? But then we get to the black horse and the pale horse. And this is where things go from being in a state of peace through violence to just violence through violence, okay? And this would seem to be Nero's era, okay? This would be when the black horse emerges and there's all this strife, all this famine in the land, okay? This would be when the war between the Jews and the Romans take place, and that's when Caesar Nero reigns, okay? And that's going to be the bulk of what John's talking about and what we're going to find when we look into some of these histories, okay? But then you get the pale rider, right? This pale horse. Well, who's that? Well, we know who that is also. As it turns out, before the Jewish and Roman war finishes, Nero dies. He actually kills himself because, like I said, he was a madman. But Titus, who is the son of Vespasian, ends up taking over and now sort of finalizing this battle between the Romans and the Jews. Titus is also the brother of Domitian. Vespasian had been leading this war under Nero previously, and then again Titus takes over when Nero dies. And per the histories, people like Josephus, okay, this era of Titus is by far the most horrific and bloody throughout the entire war. Okay, the war is really bad. It goes on for several years. Tons of people die. There's massive famine, okay, which is mentioned. There's also an internal civil war, okay, which is also mentioned in Revelation. John talks about how there'll be wars and rumors of wars. He does refer to a civil war. Well, we know from our histories that at this time, the Jewish people end up even going into a civil war against themselves because there were differing opinions about whether they should just concede to the Romans or not, and it started all this turmoil. All of this comes directly from the history of these wars, and there's some very specific details which we're going to get to in a minute. So it seems like the Pale Rider, which is when the gates of Hades open, right? That's what it actually says here, and basically all hell comes with them, is the reign of Titus at this final push of the Romans, which ends up being the thing that does eventually completely decimate the temple, okay? This is when, and it happens by AD 70 is the rough estimate, when this temple finally collapses, and at that point in time, the Jewish nation is just destroyed, okay? So this imagery not only has timetables in the book of Revelation that John gives us, but it also has very specific references and details that we find in these histories. So I'm going to skip over chapter 7 momentarily. I want to come back to that because that's a chapter where we get the famed 144,000, which directly does relate to the rapture. But I want to jump ahead to some of this other imagery that's in here. So this is chapter 9. I'm going to start at the beginning. There's this passage about the gates of hell being opened, okay? It's in chapter 9. It says, "And the fifth angel blew his trumpet, and I saw a star fall from heaven to earth." Okay, well, what does that sound like? That sounds like the image of Lucifer or Azazel. Now, Azazel, Lucifer, all of those images have close corollaries to the pagan deity Apollo. Notably, he was a fashioner of weapons, okay? And he's the person who apparently has the key to the underworld, okay? Which will be talked about later. It says, he was given the key to the shaft of the bottomless pit, okay? Sounds like Azazel, sounds like, what do you want to call him? Satan, Lucifer. This is Apollo, okay? Who is probably the first rider of the apocalypse. He opened the shaft of the bottomless pit, and from the shaft rose smoke like the smoke of a great furnace. And the sun and the air were darkened in the smoke from the shaft, then from the smoke of the locust on the earth, and they were given power like the power of the scorpions on earth. So these locusts come out of this pit, of the bottomless pit. Well, what Gentry and others have pointed out is these seem to be some reference to demonic spirits, right? The demonic spirits that have been locked away in the underworld have been let loose on earth. And it says some interesting things to allude to the fact that these things aren't, well, obviously real locusts or people. There's something different. And it says this, "And they were given power like the power of scorpions on earth. They were told not to harm the grass of the earth or any green plants or any tree, but only those people who did not have the seal of God on their foreheads." This will get back to the 144,000, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But basically, they can't harm the people of God. Okay, they were allowed to torment them for how long? 5 months. Okay, keep that in mind. But not to kill them. And their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it stings someone. And in those days, people will seek death and will not find it. They will long to die, but death will flee from them. Okay, the probable interpretation of this seems to be suggesting that this is the opening of the gates of hell and the release of these sort of demonic spirits who are allowed to reign free, and they're not allowed to actually kill anyone, but just to rain terror on them and for 5 months. And interestingly, that time frame of 5 months matches what? The Pale Rider, Titus. Titus's reign, the most horrific run of this war, at the tail end of it, in roughly 69, 70 AD, only goes for about 5 months, but it's just horrendous, okay? And again, some of the details in this can be found in these histories, like in Josephus's war. Book 4 and book 5 really go into detail on that stuff, okay? It actually mentions the name Apollo later. If we keep reading that passage, it says, "In appearance, the locusts were like horses, blah, 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 blah." And it says, "They have a king over them, the angel of the bottomless pit. His name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek he is called Apollon or Apollonian, Apollo, okay? So John is actually telling us who it is. He's telling us who essentially this entity is, and that has the key to the pit. And in that world, in Hebrew, in Greek, first century, it was Apollo. Certainly we know in other points in history, like in ancient Judaism, it was figures like Azazel, okay, which we've talked about in other videos. So this also relates to Caesar Nero because he was a worshiper of Apollo. And it seems to also relate to the arrow-carrying white horse of the apocalypse, okay? But this is the final stage, which would be the Pale Rider. So the Pale Rider, or the Pale Horse, which seems to be Titus, would have only reigned for about 5 months, which is what the histories say. Now, it's also interesting because there's this date that's given in multiple places, and I've mentioned it before. I'm going to jump ahead here, about the beast and the beast's reign, and it gives this date of, what is it? It's like 1,260 days, I believe. Having a hard time jumping around here, finding all my notes, so I apologize. I probably over-annotated my own stuff here, and now it's sometimes difficult to find it. But I believe it's basically about a 3.5 year period of time. Okay, that these numbers, if you break down the numbers, I think it's in, yeah, it is. It's 1,260 days. It's in chapter 12. Now, I had mentioned this in some ways correlates to the story of Herod in the birth of Jesus. I'll talk about that more in my next video in December. And that also seems like it could be a veiled reference because it's not exactly known, but depending on where you date the death of Herod and the birth of Christ, a lot of people say it's usually between 3 and 4 years. Well, that would be 3.5 years. 1,260 days is about 3.5 years. But more specifically to this example, the 3.5 years is actually the time that Nero was involved in the war, right? So Nero gets involved in the war, I think, around 66 AD. And basically, he's the one enforcing this war for 3.5 years. So that would actually be the 1,260 days, as John mentions. And then there's a final series of days, 5 months, really, where Titus takes over. And that actually explains those numbers perfectly in history. And when you actually, again, start reading these texts, it does illuminate even more. Let me see. There's this one passage here. This one right here, which is just horrendous, right? It tells the level of the massacre that takes place. This is in chapter 11. This starts in chapter 4. I'll just read some of this, and you can kind of get a vibe for it. It says, the beast that rises from the bottomless pit will make war on them and conquer them and kill them. And their dead bodies will lie in the streets in the great city that symbolically, so it's funny because he tells you when he's being symbolic, that symbolically is called Sodom and Egypt, where the Lord was crucified. Well, the Lord was not crucified in Sodom and Egypt, right? He was crucified in Jerusalem under Roman rule. What happened to Sodom and Egypt? They both were subjugated to the wrath of God through judgment, right? God brings judgment upon the city of Sodom for its sins. He brings judgment on the nation of Egypt in the story of Exodus, and now he's bringing judgment on Israel, okay, for their wicked ways. Okay, and that's what it's alluding to there. But it's saying there's bodies that they're dead, they'll be lying across the streets. And there's this one passage that's really interesting where it talks about the angel of the Lord reaping the harvest. And it also goes into depth about the level of violence. It actually refers to it as if a wine press. Like there's so much blood, it's like the blood of a wine press, pouring out on the city streets. Let's see if I have this right here. I think it's here. When I looked up, behold, a white cloud, and seated on the cloud, one like the Son of Man with a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. And another angel came out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to him who said out loud, put your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, for your harvest of the earth is full and ripe. So he sat on the cloud, swung his sickle to the earth, and the earth was reaped. Where is it? Here it is. So the angel swung the sickle across the earth and gathered the great harvest. Remember the story that I talked about previously about the harvesting? Okay, here we go. Here's the imagery. Harvest of the earth, and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle for 1,600 stadia. There's so much blood from the dead bodies that it actually floods the streets. Well, turns out, if you go back, and I'm not going to read it because I just read all that stuff. If you go back and look into Josephus, he actually tells the story about at the tail end of this war, when Titus has taken over, the dead bodies of the Israelites, the Jews, are so vast in number that people can't even cross the Jordan River. The river is filled with dead bodies, and the entire river runs like blood. Okay, and that's a very clear reference to a lot of this imagery that we're getting in John's Revelation. Okay, there's more stuff in here that we would talk about. We know now that the term Armageddon actually has to do with a very specific location, okay, in Rome, which is actually a battlefield. Okay, again, an actual battle, a literal physical historical fight. So, this is an actual, Armageddon is a reference to a real place. We've talked about the 7 hills. I think probably to cap this off, because I've talked for a while about things, and I could probably keep going on forever. There's one last thing I want to talk about in depth, and that is, of course, this idea of the 144,000, because that's a thing that comes back up frequently, and it does relate to a lot of the rapture theology. I'm just trying to make sure there's not anything else. Oh, there is one other thing I wanted to mention. I can't remember what chapter that was in. I don't want to have to go jump around too much. There's a passage somewhere in here in one of these prophecies about a hailstorm or hailstones falling from the heavens that are so large that they crush people under their weight. And it's another very specific image that we get in John. And one of the things that Josephus details in his history is that the Romans at this point in time actually got a hold of what he called machines, and they're catapults. And one of the things that they did to battle and defeat the Jews is they would load like darts, but also these giant like limestones and things on these catapults, and they'd fling them in the airs to crush the Jews. And it's, again, a very specific reference that very clearly maps John talking about these giant, basically stones falling from the sky. I can't find that particular passage right at this minute, but it's in there. There's just probably too much stuff I've got. Oh, here it is, right here. I just found it. I even had a note written on the side. So I've tried to make it as easy as possible for me to find it, and it didn't matter. Okay, it says this: and great hailstones, about 100 pounds each, fell from heaven on people. And they cursed God for the plague of the hail, because the plague was so severe. Well, what do we know? Josephus tells us they were actually flinging giant stones, 100 pounds and more, on the people, and they were dying. Okay, it's all right there. It's all right in the history of the Roman-Jewish war. Okay, so let's go back now to the 144,000, and I think we'll close out there because I've already gone 21 minutes, so that's not too bad. But I do want to talk about this real quick. So this is chapter 7. Okay. So it says this. I'll just read this whole part here. It says, after this I saw 4 angels standing on the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth, and no wind might blow on the earth or sea against any tree. Then I saw another angel ascending from the rising sun in the seal of the living God, and he called with a loud voice to the 4 angels who had been given power, blah, 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 do not harm the earth, etc. He said, do not harm the earth and the sea and the trees until we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads. And I heard the number of the sealed, 144,000, sealed from every tribe of the sons of Israel. Okay, and it gives all the lists of the tribes. And it basically says, we know there's 12 tribes of Israel. They give 12,000 people from the 12 tribes of Israel are sort of marked with this mark of God. That means they're safe from tribulation. Okay, this is the 144,000 that people utilize when they think about the people who are going to be raptured before the tribulation. Okay, well, it turns out, first of all, it's very clear who they're talking about. Jews. Okay, it's very clear which Jews they're talking about. The ones living right here in the first century. Okay, and while the number 144,000 is likely symbolic because it's 12,000 from each 12 tribes, so it's just using the number 12, but 12,000 would have been it sounds like a lot of people, but considering the entire nation, 12,000 of each tribe is a very small amount. It's meaning there's only going to be very few people who end up being the quote-unquote elect that don't get subjugated to this tribulation. Okay, so that's where that number comes from. That's what it's about, but wait, it goes on from there, okay? Because this is where it gets interesting. Let's see here. So this is the passage I started reading before and I stopped because I was reading the wrong passage at the wrong time. I'll back up to chapter 7, verse 9. And this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and people and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, with palm branches in their hands, and crying out in a loud voice, salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne and the Lamb. And all the angels were standing around the throne and around the elders and the 4 living creatures. And they fell on their feet before the throne and worshiped God, saying, Amen. Blessing and glory and wisdom and thanksgiving and honor and power and might be to our God forever, and amen. Then one of the elders addressed me, saying, who are these clothed in white robes? And from there, where have they come? And I said to him, Sir, you know. And he said to me, these are the ones coming out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. So this is this scene where they're sort of at the throne of heaven or whatever, and one of the elders, right, there's 24 elders that are sitting at the throne of God, is asking who these are, and he's saying, well, these are the elect. These are the people that made it, okay? So this is, again, a lot of times this image of rapture theology, which is not historically accurate. But here's what's fascinating. This is from Eusebius, the Jewish historian who wrote about the first century. And this is actually book 3, chapter 5, the last siege of the Jews of Christ. I'm just going to read one passage, which is basically 3. It's not really verses, but because it's such a dense material, they do break it down into sections similar to how we break down the Bible. So it would be book 3, chapter 5, verse 3, for lack of a better term. And here is what Eusebius writes. Pay attention. The whole body, however, of the church of Jerusalem, having been commanded by a divine revelation given to men of approved piety, there before the war, removed from the city and lived at a certain town beyond the Jordan called Pelel. Here, those who believed in Christ removed from Jerusalem, as if holy men had entirely abandoned the royal city itself in the whole land of Judea. And then it goes on after that to say the divine justice of Christ and his apostles was fully blah, 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 destroying the Jews. Okay, he's actually saying here, this is according to his historical account, that a group of these Jews who had adopted the teachings of Christ had actually been commanded by a divine revelation, John's revelation, to leave the area and remove themselves from the city and go to a town outside the Jordan called Pelel. And there they removed with the city of Jerusalem fell. There's your 144,000. Right there. These are the Jews who listened to the prophecy of John, who adhered to the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, and recognized the sign of the times, and as a result of it, left Jerusalem. They left and fled to a small territory in the outskirts, and they survived the tribulation as a result of that. Okay, and that's actually in the history book. Okay, it's right there. It's also, just as a caveat, an interesting point that they're still referring to the Christians and the Jews as a synonymous people group. Okay, this is important for lots of reasons, because one of the things we know is after the collapse of the temple and after the fall of Israel, the Israelites in Jerusalem, there becomes a very clear divide moving forward between those people who call themselves Christians, who are the new movement that's open to all people, Gentile and Jew alike, versus the Jews. But there was this period of time where those two things were so tightly knit that the Christian community was largely still within the Jewish community. And these references in Revelation and in Eusebius and in Josephus show us that when this was happening, there still wasn't that clear line, which gives us an early date, a clear early date that had to be before 70 AD. But moreover, one last thing I'll mention that I was going to bring up anyways, I think it's in chapter 11, there's passages in Revelation about the temple. Okay, so it's right here, chapter 11. When I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, rise and measure the temple of God and the altar of those who worship there. Well, what's the temple of God? It's a temple of Jerusalem. You know, it's their temple. Well, why would John of Patmos be writing about measuring the temple if the temple's already been destroyed? Okay, this is another really clear evidence that this text had to have been written prior to the fall of the temple. Okay, not after. And of course, the most obvious evidence is there's no mention of a fallen temple. There's no mention of the actual war between the Jews and the Romans. It's all couched in this symbolic language that only makes sense years later when the war happens. And then all of a sudden, all these prophecies, hailstorms and the blood in the streets and the coming of the red horse and the black horse and the pale rider, all of this stuff now makes sense because it actually happens in first century Rome, between 66 AD and 70 AD, more or less. So this is where all that symbolism comes from. That is your 4 riders of the apocalypse. Apollo, probably. Augustus, Caesar Augustus. Caesar Nero. Titus. Okay? Those are your 4 riders. And each of them, one is the Antichrist who starts the whole process. He's the one who ends up opening the gates of hell at the tail end of the war. The second is Augustus Caesar, who sort of heads the Roman Empire, becomes the first official Caesar of the empire, even though there were previous Caesars of the nation. Rome becomes an empire. He becomes that, and he rules with the sword, but he brings peace through the sword. Okay. Then the black dragon of death, famine, civil war, all highlighted in here. That's the start of Nero's reign. Then the pale horse, which is the 5 months at the end after the 3.5-year reign of Nero, which results in the most egregious parts of the war, when the locusts, when the scorpion demons come out from hell and they're given free reign. And that's when we get the passages of when there's so much blood in the streets, it's like a wine press. And you can't even cross because there's so many bodies of dead Jewish people. Okay? And all of this is related to the judgment of Israel, not unlike the city of Sodom, not unlike the city of Egypt, right? It's all right there. And the temple, according to the text, when it was written, was still standing. Okay? So hopefully you found that interesting. There's a ton more stuff I could talk about. It's almost like an endless conversation. I never meant to make 3 full videos on Revelation. In fact, if you go back and watch my first video, which was part of my 10-part Bible study series, I intentionally really kind of limited what I said about Revelation. I didn't even make the whole video about it. I made it sort of about just prophetic literature as a whole. But then I kind of was like, there's so many people that still kind of like mockingly more. It used to be that you had people who just sort of like really bought into this stuff, and it was just kind of problematic because they like literally were like, oh no, the 144,000 and the rapture. Now it's become like a joke. So, if someone wants to believe that, I mean, everyone's entitled to believe what they want to believe. But when it starts to just become a joke and it's sort of just like it's just a mockery, well, then it's like, okay, it's funny. It should be a joke because it's wrong. But that's not actually what the text says, people. Like you're trying to, because there's a bunch of people out there with really bad theology, don't make them the examples by which you refer to the Christian religion. There is actual people who have real answers to this stuff, and it's not probably as silly and crazy as one might think. So again, I'll leave you with that. I'll be back with another video next month. I'm not planning on making more. I wasn't planning on making this video though either, so who knows. But there will at least be one video, and I've planned to drop that on Christmas Eve because it's about the birth of Jesus, and that one's a really interesting one. It might be my favorite one I've ever recorded. So stay tuned for that. All right. Thank you for watching. Bye.